They were written by a Syrian by the name of Ibrahim Cosh, who was just a regular guy, who you heard actually at the very end. That was him doing the call and response thing with the crowds in Syria. And he was sort of one of these people who just bubbled up spontaneously, I mean, from the revolts and kind of became sort of a street artist urging the thing on. And obviously Omar Effendim took these rhyming couplets and made a solidarity video out of them. Ibrahim Cosh is a very important figure because the fact that he was saying those things, those very anti-regime things, in a public square over a loudspeaker is absolutely amazing for those of you who know something about Syria under the regimes of Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. That was one of and remains one of the most repressive police states in the entire Arab world, and sentiments like that are not things that you share except with your closest friends in very private settings. You don't say them out loud. So the fact that he did so, and repeatedly in many different settings, showed that conclusively that the sort of wall of fear that authoritarian regimes in the Arab world had spent so much time building up over the decades had been smashed by the revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, and especially by the fact that those revolts succeeded in their immediate goals. So there was, in 2011, a feeling of tremendous optimism that the revolts would not only succeed there, but also in Syria. What happened to Ibrahim Cosh, this very brave man? Well, some months after this video was made, he was found, I believe, in an irrigation ditch, dumped there rather unceremoniously with his larynx cut out. Almost certainly a crime committed by the security services of the regime, an act of symbolic violence, of course, removing the body part that posed the direct threat to the regime, a sort of a trademark of police states. This symbolic violence, which is intended to show to the people, you can't, whatever you think you can do, you can't do it. We have something similar from the Egyptian experience now, where there was one of the precursors to the Egyptian uprising that unseated Hosni Mubarak was the rise of a very powerful independent trade union movement. This was significant because since the 1950s, there had been no such thing in Egypt as an independent trade union. To go on strike was in fact a crime, punishable by imprisonment or worse. The leader of this independent trade movement, Canal Abu Eita, was a major figure in the uprising itself against Mubarak. He was made Minister of Labor by the government that came to power in Egypt in July of this year, the one that unseated President Mohamed Morsi. And he turned around and helped the Egyptian security services crush a strike by one of these very same unions that he had helped to encourage to engage in job actions. So this was a comparable symbolic setback for the forces of change that have been coursing through the region. 2013 has been a dark year in the Arab world, just 2 years after this very hopeful one, with reactionary forces dug in and seeming to be prevailing at the moment. But nevertheless, I want to argue this evening that there is reason for hope in the new Middle East. It's not guaranteed, far from it, but the possibility of real change exists, and that is something new in my lifetime. To appreciate that, we need to first zoom out to the geostrategic level and then zoom way in to the social historical level. Why is the Middle East so important to geostrategists? Well, for centuries, it has been the crossroads of the world, the place lying between the great continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, a land bridge between Europe and Asia. The shipping lanes around this region have long been considered strategic by states. And of course, starting in the 1930s, the region became doubly strategic, if not trebly so, because of the discovery of massive amounts of oil. It cannot be emphasized enough times that the Persian Gulf is the site of 2/3 of the world's proven reserves of oil, and as much as 1/3 of the proven reserves of natural gas. Great powers thus seek what they call the stability of the region, meaning primarily the regulated flow of oil to the world market, to the world economy at regulated prices, and the maintenance of the regimes that either sit on top of that oil or in proximity to those shipping lanes, and are cooperative with the first objective of the flow of oil out of the region. The United States is no different in this regard. That is what the United States, since it has become a great power in the region, has sought. Let me quote to you the words of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in September of 1978, which laid out 3 strategic goals for the United States. Number 1, to assure continuous access to petroleum resources. Number 2, to prevent an inimical power or combination of powers from establishing hegemony. And number 3, to assure the survival of Israel as an independent state in a stable relationship with contiguous Arab states. These are what have been called the 3 pillars of US policy in the Middle East, US grand strategy in the Middle East: oil, Israel, and stability. These commitments are consistent and they are bipartisan. Democratic and Republican administrations alike, going back to Truman, have pursued them consistently. And it's irrespective of sort of ideological or foreign policy orientation, whether you're a liberal internationalist or all the way to neoconservative, you basically follow these things. The differences between US administrations have been tactical or not strategic. For proof of this, let's look to the words of President Jimmy Carter, who is known in our political culture for being primarily interested in human rights as foreign policy. Well, in 1980, Jimmy Carter famously used his State of the Union address to vow, quote, "Any attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States. It will be repelled by the use of any means necessary, including military force." That is what is now known as the Carter Doctrine, which led to the deployment of the Rapid Deployment Force, massive deployment of the US Navy to the Persian Gulf during the Iran-Iraq War, which led then to permanent US bases in the Persian Gulf, which led then to the ease with which the United States deployed in 1991 to kick Iraq out of Kuwait, which led through a long series of torturous events eventually to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the fall of Saddam Hussein. And of course, the US Navy continues to base its Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf. The goal of this forward-leaning posture in the Persian Gulf, as Donald Rumsfeld calls it, is not to get oil for US oil companies or domestic consumption or to boost the profits of Chevron and Conoco, although those are probably nice fringe benefits, but rather to assure the flow of oil to the world at regulated prices. From the standpoint of US policymakers, going back to the Truman administration, really going back to World War II, oil is a strategic commodity primarily, not a commercial one, although the commercial benefits are nice. So, what does this have to do with this concept of stability? That means that the US historically has been very solicitous of the stability of regional governments that are oil-rich and US allied, or that have some degree of rapprochement with Israel. So for instance, the key US goals vis-a-vis Egypt over the years have been to keep the Suez Canal open to tankers, oil tankers and warships, flow of oil, shipping lanes, and also to prevent another multi-front Arab-Israeli war. Because in 1973, when the US sided with Israel in that war, the Arabs imposed an oil embargo. We don't want that to recur. So the US has therefore sought peace with those countries in the Arab world that are the so-called frontline states, Egypt and Jordan successfully. The US historically has abandoned its allied regimes in the region, all of which have been not democratic, only at the bitter end, when they have calculated that those regimes cannot survive. And that's precisely what happened with Mubarak in 2011. History shows that US strategic interests will trump rhetoric of democracy and human rights every single time. Because the US sees like a state. It acts in its interests, not in comportment with abstract values. And in that sense, it's very important for us as Americans to realize that regardless of what we were taught in civics class, our government behaves just like all other governments would if they had so much power. There's no such thing as American exceptionalism in that regard. But because the degree of US power is so great, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, what the United States does and says plays an outsized role in world affairs, and that is exceptional. There is no other state on the world stage today that can replace the US role in the Middle East, though Russia would like to, and China probably would too, and China may someday actually try to do that. But today, there are only two powers that can shake the foundations of US hegemony in the region. One is the American people, who could demand a fundamental rethinking of US grand strategy. And the second is the peoples of the region that could move to overthrow the quote-unquote stable states that have been cooperating with these US strategic interests over the years and usher in new states that are more closely aligned with popular interests. Since 2011, that latter scenario has actually become a real possibility for the first time in decades. And that accounts for what may appear to be the incoherence, confusion, and disorientation that characterizes Obama's Middle East policy. That's certainly what the Republicans say about it. And it's because, for the first time in decades, the US, the State Department, and the intelligence agencies, they really don't know what's going to happen. The outcome is uncertain. So now let's zoom back in. The Tunisian and Egyptian experiences had torn down the wall of fear that previously had been a huge obstacle to political dissent of any kind, let alone a mass movement aiming at regime change. They had also dispelled the gloom in the region, the ambient feeling that the Arab world, for whatever reason, was stuck with bad government by totally unaccountable potentates and presidents for life. The Syrian regime, in fact, was the prototype of that latter type of system. Nominally a republic, the Syrian state was, in reality, a one-party police state, probably the single most repressive one in the Arab world after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Since 1970, the state built a cult of personality around one man, Hafez al-Assad, and then around his son, Bashar, both of whom had the title of president. The regime was and is a notorious torturer of dissidents, and also, until recently, had the grim distinction among Arab regimes of deploying its army against citizens of the Republic, as it did in Hama in 1982. The electoral exercises held by the regime were utterly hollow, referenda in which the people could vote yes or no for another term in office for the Assads. Voting was bought or coerced, generating artificially high turnouts, and of course, hardly anyone dared to vote no in any case. After Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, there was a brief period of optimism known, ironically, as the Damascus Spring, when the regime seemed to be playing with the idea of opening up the political system and maybe even allowing a free election. But that brief opening was followed rapidly by retrenchment and the arrogance of absolute and unearned power and privilege that has been shown by the regime of Bashar al-Assad since. If we can bring this up. Yes. Okay. This is a political cartoon that is actually not by a Syrian, it's by an Egyptian by the name of Osman Bahget. He's my favorite political cartoonist. And this is a representation of life in regimes like Syria's that built cults of personality around the president. So this is a watch, a wristwatch sold in the Republic of Bahkatiya. The dictator's name is Bahkatos. And this says the local time in the Republic of Bahkatiya Lozma. It's capped by the guy's mustache, right? And then here is a vote or a polling card, a ballot in the Republic of Bahkatiya, and your choices are yes, 2 yeses, and multiple yeses. Well, why did Syrians stand for such a rotten political system? Coercion, of course, was a big part of it, but it was considerably more than that. After independence from colonial rule, Syria became governed according to what has been called the authoritarian bargain. By this bargain, the regime essentially suspended the civil and political rights of the population in exchange for providing people with a welfare state of varying generosity. In the Syrian case, Syria is a middle-income country, not a rich one like Saudi Arabia. It has a large peasantry as well as a manufacturing sector and a rapidly urbanizing population, so it has a diverse economy. After independence, the state took over industrial and other enterprises employing hundreds of thousands of people and created a vast bureaucracy that employed millions of the university graduates who could now attend state-run universities for free. The state subsidized both agricultural production and basic consumer goods. All this it did in the name of accelerated social and economic development and the promise of higher standards of living for the population in the future. So trading essentially the promise of social and economic development, higher standards of living for political loyalty, political quiescence. And in many ways, this model, this authoritarian bargain, did pay long-term dividends for a lot of people. From 1970 to 2010, life expectancy in Syria rose from 52 to over 72. In that same period, the average number of years of education went up from 1.4 to 5.5, an increase of 4.1 years as the result of the introduction of mandatory schooling for children. In each of those areas, the statistics for Syria in this period are actually better than those in Latin America. The pace of the gains was fueled early on by economic growth that in the 1960s averaged around 6% per year. And crucially as well, a growing percentage of professionals and white-collar workers, particularly in the state bureaucracy, were women. And so the rise of the new post-colonial states in the Arab world, not just in Syria, but also Egypt, Iraq, and other places, and the consolidation of this authoritarian bargain became associated with the greater education and greater economic independence of women, though without tackling other aspects of traditional patriarchy as one might have hoped. So Syria's present torment is rooted in the erosion of this authoritarian bargain. As the decades passed, the pace of development slowed. GDP growth slowed. The benefits of growth, crucially, became distributed much less evenly across society. Those at the top of the social and economic pyramid began to chafe at the binds of the command economy and its heavy investment in the state-owned sector. And so in the 90s, and especially in the 2000s, the Assad regime propounded what was called a social market economy